Guys, let's keep it going. Last video I talked about the interpreted language versus the compiled language and what happens during the compile phase and what scope is. And just to get the summary going, and JavaScript is a compiler language, and during the compile phase, JavaScript or the compiler talks to the scope engine to do all these function declarations. What is function declarations, right? We're going to talk about what is function declarations and what exactly happens in compile phase. Now, in JavaScript, there's two different phases, the compile phase and the execution phase. Execution phase is actually when all the codes are run, and compile phase is when all those codes are read. And we're going to talk about this phase where when all the codes are read before execution. So this is the compile phase. Now, the compiler during the compile phase, like the name suggests, it gets it reads everything, and its job is to uh, get all the function and variable declarations and talk to the scope engine to store them. It communicates with the scope engine during the compile phase. Now, if you are just out in the open, think of scope uh, as a black hole, as we talked about, but it's structured in a hierarchy, uh, or like a bubble. Like think about a scope, and outside there is a bigger scope of another scope, and then outside there is a bigger scope, and then outside there is another bigger scope that enwraps all of them, and then finally there's this huge scope that is the master of all things, that is global scope. You might have heard about global variables and things like that, and it basically means variable declarations are stored under the global scope, and this place, this realm, this engine where it stores everything, this black hole. So there's nest and hierarchy of these black holes of scope engines outside of another, until later on there's this huge black hole of scope that just stores everything, sucks in everything, and you could just grab things out of it. And so we're in global scope, and the compile phase, the compiler reads the first line. A lot of people think that this is two statement because we have a variable declarations and then we make an assignment. I come from Ruby background and I truly thought this was one statement, but in JavaScript it is two different statements in one. First of all, whenever a statement starts with var, it means it's a variable declarations, which means variable is being declared. And then there's an assignment called foo equals var, which basically gets the variable, or this is called identifier, gets the identifier and assign it to a value, and this is called immediate value because um, it's a string that doesn't need to be manipulated in any way to get a exact value, so it's immediate value. And then this is var at the front, which is a variable declarations, and then there is the assignment. So assignment happens in execution time. In compile phase, all compiler does is do variable and function declarations. Now, it's found the variable declaration, it talks to the current scope. We're in global scope right now. It goes, hey, global scope, we have a variable declaration, and we want to store this variable declaration into your scope engine. Scope engine says, okay, let's declare it, bring it in. So we're gonna write all these codes again. This happens. Variable foo, variable gets declared, gets stored into the global scope. Assignment doesn't happen, we skip it. We go to the next line, and the compiler talks to the global scope again and goes, hey, we have a variable foo, again, declaration, and we need to store it into your scope engine. And scope engine goes, no, we already declared it, we already stored it, so skip it. So we skip it. We go to the function declaration this time. How do we know if it's a function declaration? It's a function declarations if the statement starts with a keyword called function. So if we have something called like this, right? This is iffy, immediately invoked function expression. And what's important to note here is that there is a parenthesis at the front, which means it's not a function declaration. Function declaration always starts out the statement with function keyword. What about this? Variable yellow. Nope. Because it starts with var, variable declaration, which is not it doesn't start the statement with function keyword, therefore it's not a function declaration. So it's only a function declaration if it starts out with the keyword function. And here it is. It talks to the global scope and goes, hey, we have a function declaration called BAR. We want to store this into your global scope engine. So it stores this function into the global scope. However, unlike variable declarations, when you store function declarations into the global scope, it actually creates the function object itself completely. So it's getting stored, right? Oops. Like that, right? It gets stored into the function, into the global scope, but the whole function actually gets created. So we go into the function, right? And we see another variable declaration called variable foo. And then so the compiler talks to the scope engine that this variable declaration is in, and it is not inside of a global scope this time. It's inside the function object just got created inside. Remember, I said function is the global scope. Function is in JavaScript. Only unit of scope is function. So this is a scope. Function object is a scope itself, which means compiler talks to the scope of bar and goes, hey, we have a variable declaration called foo. We're gonna store it into your scope engine. And then so the scope of bar stores foo. It doesn't get declared in global scope. Variable foo, this guy, no, this guy, in global scope got stored into the global scope engine. But because function is actually a unit of scope, foo gets declared and gets stored into BAR. And then what's left is foo equals baz, which is an assignment that happens in runtime, so we skip it. And it's also very important to understand that how to explain this. Okay, for function objects, um, you could if you want, whenever you see a name for a function, just think of it as this is same as variable bar equals function blah blah blah. So it basically creates a variable declaration, right? And then it encapsulates function object as a value and puts it in. And we just kind of write it like this. It's the same thing. And that's where I'm saying this is very different from variable declaration, because by logic, if these two are kind of the same thing, why are we not skipping it, right? Like in variable declaration, we didn't do the assignment, but we did it here. But that's just one thing that you just kind of have to take it in. If it's written like this, then function bar is actually a variable that holds the function object, but function object, it's because it's a function declaration, because it's the statement starts with function, it actually goes in and actually creates the function object. Okay, so remember, the foo got stored into BAR, not global scope. Alright, so that's done. And then we go to the next. Oh yeah, and here's another thing that I forgot to mention. After the variable declaration was created like this and the function declaration was created like this, remember scope is like a black hole. It gets stored into the scope engine, right? That whole process of going up and getting stored into the scope engine is something we call hoisting, and we call that hoisting. There's tons of blogs about it. You can read about it. And basically, hoisting is this idea that was created by people that that happens when the process of these declarations, function and variable declarations, getting dragged up and floating up in the air and getting stored into the scope engine. And during that hoisting, variable declarations happen first, then we have function declarations happen next. However, function declarations, even if it was declared later, always take precedence over variable declarations. So you actually get stored like this. Now, we go to function baz. Right? This starts the statement with a function keyword, which means this is a function declaration, because it starts out with the function keyword with the statement. I keep repeating myself, but this is really because, you know, if you keep hearing it, you don't have to try to remember it. You know, if you actually do pay attention, um, you know, these repetitions will, you know, naturally just kind of like go in, you know, and it will stick in. So I just keep emphasizing what is important, and this is one thing that I have learned from the book too. So I know that I'm not really doing the wrong thing here. Okay, so function declaration right here is happening right here with BAS, right? And then it talks to the current global scope and goes, hey, we have another function declaration. We're going to store BAS inside of the global scope, this function. And with function declarations, function object actually gets instantiated. It actually gets created immediately. So we go in, right? We go into this function to create what is necessary. Now look, there's no variable declarations. There is no function declarations inside. Even if the function is a scope, just treat it as we're out here into the global scope, right? We were looking for variable declarations. We were looking for function declarations. Function declaration happened. That means function object was created. We go in and we look for variable and function declarations like we were outside in global scope, except now we're in BAS scope of BAS, because function is a scope itself. It's a unit of scope in JavaScript. So we created a mini scope, which is a private scope inside. You know, think of it as like a black hole here and a bigger black hole here. And this is a private black hole, and this black hole consumes this black hole. Okay, so there's no variable declarations, and remember during the compile phase that we are in right now, we only care about variable declarations. So we skip it? No. What happens is there is a parameter called foo. This is an implicit variable declaration. Even if there is no variable front here, it's implicit, meaning it is treated like a variable declaration, even if it's a parameter. Because ultimately, it's a variable that stores whatever you put in during this, whenever you call BAS function, and then put in whatever object or value you put in here, becomes a value to this variable. So it's a variable declaration that belongs to the scope. So variable foo happens, right? Same thing, like that. Variable foo happens. Basically, it gets declared, gets sucked into this BAS, gets stored into this scope. No, sorry, I don't want to do that. And this happens next. Remember, it takes precedence over variable declaration, so it goes up here. So I really hope this is making sense. I feel like this could be kind of confusing. This is implicit variable declaration. It gets, because it's in the scope of BAS, it gets stored into the scope of BAS. I hope that makes sense. All right. So that's it. You know, and then this is the compile phase. This is exactly what happens during the compile phase, right? And this is what gets hoisted, right? And then during the runtime, when you go back in, what's left? What's left, right? Variable foo got declared. So when you go into the runtime and you read the code again, what's left is foo equals bar. Oops. That's left. Because variable foo was already created and got stored into the global scope, right? So during the execution phase, all these assignments happen, which we're gonna get into the next video. I'm gonna rewrite all of these so that it's much more easier to understand. So basically, this code turns into this by the end of after the compile phase. To summarize it, all the variable declarations and function declarations are declared, got stored under the global scope. This is all global scope. Up, everything up here is a global scope. You know, it gets everything stored into the global scope, and variable foo gets, this is BAS scope, and this is stored into the bash scope, this function, this variable declaration, and everything else is stored into global scope. And during the compile phase, the only codes that are left, because everything was already declared, function and variable declarations were declared and got stored into the global scope. Only thing that is left by the time we execute the codes and read it again, what I mean by that is, remember compile phase and the running phase, everything is read first. And in JavaScript, when it's read, all the function and variable declarations happen. And during the second time, when it's runtime, to run the code, what we find here is only these. That is it. And we're gonna run into more about the execution and stuff like that in the next video. I hope this was very helpful. I'll see you next time.